What's up, sports fans? This is the Lucas Ross Sports Channel. We continue with our 2025 college football schedule preview and very early projected record series. The Alabama Crimson Tide are up next. Before we look ahead to 2025, let's take a look back at what Alabama did in 2024. Here were my projections and predictions last year for Alabama. My projection for this team was 10-2, and then my prediction for Alabama was 9-3. So I was actually a little bit lower on Alabama, but that's exactly what Alabama did. They went 9-3 in the regular season last year, but if you count their bowl game loss to Michigan, this team went 9-4. So you could probably say as an Alabama fan, this was definitely a disappointing season. Alabama missing out on the college football playoff. I don't think it was a disappointing season. You know, it's obviously with Kalen DeBoer his first year. I mean, he had some talent on this roster, but it wasn't really the same kind of talent that they used to have when Nick Saban was here at Alabama. It was just a new era, and they also had a pretty tough schedule. Here's a look at that schedule from last season for Alabama. And looking at who they played in the non-conference, they played Western Kentucky, South Florida, on the road at Wisconsin, and then Mercer. So not a tough non-conference schedule. Wisconsin, obviously a pretty tough place to play, but that game was not really even close whatsoever. I think the reason why, Tyler Van Dyke, of course, going down with the injury, I think that really kind of gave Alabama just an advantage, and they still had the talent advantage, but they just had an advantage pretty much the rest of the games. So not a tough non-conference schedule. Then you look at their SEC schedule from last year. First off, looking at their home games, they played Georgia, South Carolina, Missouri, and Auburn. So they had 4 games at home last year in the SEC, and they won all of them against these teams. And then you look at their road schedule. The road schedule ended up being a lot tougher than expected for Alabama. First off, they played Vanderbilt, Tennessee, and then also LSU and Oklahoma, so they also had 4 away games in the SEC. But yeah, Vanderbilt losing to them on the road in Nashville, that was one of the biggest upsets last year, in my opinion, in the entire college football season. And I think after that upset happened, a lot of upsets just continued to play out that way. And yeah, Vanderbilt was a big surprise team from last year, which we did not expect. Tennessee, they lost to Tennessee here by 7 points in Knoxville, and then they lost to Oklahoma. Actually got blown out in this game like 24-3. So yeah, it was a tough schedule for Alabama, but let's now take a look at 2025. This is the schedule coming up for the Crimson Tide for the upcoming 2025 season. And before we go game by game, let's take a look at who Alabama plays in the non-conference for this season. So this is their non-conference schedule. They, of course, will play Florida State on the road this year, and then they'll play ULM Monroe, Wisconsin again, but this time at home. And then they play Eastern Illinois. So you get a couple of cupcake games in the non-conference, but you got to go on the road to play Florida State and Tallahassee. Yeah, that's not going to be an easy game, but I think Alabama actually might be favored because Florida State was not really good last year. We don't really know how good Florida State's going to be. Will they be better this year, or they're going to be a lot worse? We never know. But this team went 2-10 last year, and they were one of the worst teams in the ACC from last year. But yeah, playing on the road won't be easy, of course. But Alabama should be probably favored. And then Wisconsin, you played them again, but this time you get them at home in a rematch from last year. And I think Alabama probably will be big favorites there as well against the Badgers because it's at home. But that's your non-conference schedule. You got a couple of Power 4 teams on here, which makes it a little bit tougher. But yeah, not a tough non-conference schedule whatsoever. It could be a lot worse. Let's now move on to the home SEC schedule for Alabama. They'll play 4 home games in the SEC. They'll play Vanderbilt, Tennessee, LSU, and Oklahoma. So you look at 3 out of these 4 home games. Vanderbilt, Tennessee, and Oklahoma, these are all revenge games for Alabama. They lost to these 3 teams last year all on the road, but this time they will play all 3 of these teams at home. And then LSU, you obviously, blew them out last year. LSU, I think, will be a little bit better this year. I get it. It's at home for Alabama. They should have an advantage, but these are 2 very talented teams that are just so pretty even, and this is always a really exciting game to watch. So that's your home schedule. It sets up pretty well for Alabama. Let's now move on to the away schedule. They're going to be playing 4 road games in the SEC. They'll play on the road at Georgia, at Missouri, at South Carolina, and then also Auburn. So This is a pretty tough road schedule for Alabama. Georgia on the road is going to be very tough. South Carolina, always a pretty tough place to play, especially when it's at nighttime. It's always a really tough place to play, no matter what the time is down there. And then you got Auburn, of course, in the Iron Bowl. That's obviously a very entertaining game to watch every year. I mean, obviously last year's game was not close, but a couple of years ago, Alabama nearly lost this game, so that won't be an easy game as always. And then Missouri, that could be a pretty tricky trap game there. You know, Missouri, I don't really think they're going to be really as good as they were in the last couple of years. They were kind of overrated last year because they had a pretty easy schedule, and last year's game between these two teams was not really close. I guess when Missouri played big games, they were just not really good against like the talented teams. So that's your away schedule. Again, you got some 3 tough road games on here: Georgia, South Carolina, and Auburn. So let's now go back to the schedule here and go full game by game now for Alabama. Again, they'll start things off with Florida State. Again, that game will be on the road on August 30th in Tallahassee. Again, not an easy non-conference game to kick off the year. But again, I think Alabama might be favored in that game. You never know. Then they play ULM Monroe on September 6th. Then it's Wisconsin at home on September 13th. So they play 3 out of their 4 non-conference games to kick off the season. And then their first bye week, of course, comes right before playing Georgia on the road. Pretty good spot for a bye week. You got 3 games to kind of warm up before you play a very talented Georgia team. And that game, of course, will be on September 27th. Then they'll come back at home to play Vanderbilt on October 4th. Then back on the road at Missouri on October 11th. And then back at home again against Tennessee on October 18th. Then they play on the road again, but this time on the road at South Carolina on October 25th. Then their second bye week, of course, comes right before playing a rivalry game against LSU on November 8th. Then they'll play Oklahoma on November 15th, so they got back-to-back home games there. And then they play Eastern Illinois, and then on the road at Auburn to close things out in the Iron Bowl on November 29th. So that's your schedule for Alabama for 2025. No back-to-back road games, of course, which I think is really good news, but this is a schedule that won't be pretty easy for Alabama, in my opinion. Again, you got some tough road games: Florida State, Georgia, South Carolina, and then Auburn, and then you got possibly a trap game there with Missouri on October 11th. But let's now get to the projection here for Alabama based on how tough this schedule is. This is the scale I'll be using here for their projection for 2025. And again, we count the red games as automatic losses, but you're not going to be able to see any games here in the red, orange, or yellow for Alabama because most of these games, almost all of them, Alabama will be favored at least in almost every single one of their games, and then the rest of the games might be just 50-50 games. 20% games in the orange, though, those are games where Alabama will be a double-digit underdog by 10 to 14 points. Your 40% games in the yellow, those will be games where Alabama will be a clear underdog game by about a touchdown, by 6, 7, 8 points, somewhere in that range. 50-50 games, like I talk about, it will stay in the white, games that really can go either way. 60% games in the purple are games where Alabama will be favored by 6, 7, 8 points, so by about a touchdown. And then your blue games at 80%, those are games where Alabama will be favored by double digits, 10 to 14 points. And then your 99% games in the green, that's pretty much your automatic wins. So we'll start with that percentage here first, the automatic wins here for Alabama on this schedule. I think you got a couple of them. 2 out of your 4 non-conference games, ULM Monroe and Eastern Illinois. Alabama should have no problem in, both of these games. It would be a big shocker if they were to lose both of these games, or not both of them, but, at least one of the 2. But I just don't see that happening. Alabama definitely should be able to big favorites in both of these games by like 17 or 20 plus points. And I think definitely these games are over that 95, to 99% mark. So yeah, Alabama should be able to win both of these games pretty easily. And they're not guaranteed wins, but we count them as automatic wins here in this projection. We also count the blue games as wins, which brings me to my next percentage here, where Alabama's going to be favored by double digits, so by about a couple of touchdowns, 10 to 14 points. I also think you got a couple of them on here, Wisconsin and Vanderbilt. Last year's game against Wisconsin was not really close. Alabama plays them at home this year. That's pretty much the main reason why it's in the blue. I don't really know how good Wisconsin's going to be. I hope they can probably, figure things out and get this program back to where it needs to be. But yeah, Alabama should be probably probably favored here by 10 to 14. And again, the reason why it's in the blue is because it's at home here for the Crimson Tide. And look, I know Vanderbilt beat Alabama last year, but this year it's at home for Alabama. And I just don't think Vanderbilt really has what it takes to pull off a huge upset in Tuscaloosa, especially at Bryant-Denny Stadium. This is a very tough place to play, and Alabama just never seems to struggle when they're playing at home. And I know they've had some, tough home games in the past, but they went undefeated last year, and I feel like just Alabama playing at home in general is just a very more talented team. So, yeah, Vanderbilt, you can make an argument that it should be in the purple just because Vanderbilt beat them last year, but I know there's a lot of hype around this Vanderbilt team, but I don't really want to go that far yet with this team. So these two games, I think Alabama will be favored in both of them by double digits. We also count them as wins, but not just like the green games. They're not guaranteed wins, but they're counted as wins here in this projection. Then we go to the next percentage in the purple. That's where Alabama will be favored here by 6, 7, 8 points, so by about a touchdown. But this time I got 3 of them in the purple: Florida State, Oklahoma, and Auburn. So 2 games on the road and then 1 game at home. Florida State will be obviously very tough just because it's on the road. That's the reason why it's in the purple. Same thing for Auburn. Look, I get it. Auburn is a rivalry game. That's a game that really can go either way, but last year's game was just not really close, and that's the reason why Alabama is favored by a touchdown. And then Florida State obviously was not really good last year. They were one of the worst teams in the ACC. So I feel like Alabama will be favored in both of these games on the road by 6, 7, 8 points. And because Oklahoma beat Alabama last year, that's the reason why it's a 6, 7, 8 point spread here favored for Alabama. And because it's at home, that's the reason why it's in the purple. And Oklahoma is definitely a more physical team compared to Vanderbilt. So yeah, all 3 of these games, I think Alabama will be favored in all of them by 6, 7, 8 points. And then I got 5 50-50 games on here: Georgia, Missouri, Tennessee, South Carolina, and LSU. These are all 5 games that really can go either way. Obviously, I've been having a very tough time with Missouri. I know that's a game that probably should be in the purple, and it should be because Missouri was overrated last year, but I think that could be a trap game. Missouri obviously and Alabama kind of tied for, that kind of place spot in the top contender category between these two teams. I think they're probably in the same tier. But yeah, Missouri, that is on the road. That's the reason why it's a 50-50 game. If it was at home for Alabama, it would definitely be in the purple, but I'm going to stick with it here and put it in the white. And then South Carolina gave Alabama all kinds of trouble last year, and playing on the road, that's a very tough place to play. That's the reason why it's a 50-50 game. And then Georgia, LSU, and Tennessee. These are all pretty even matchups that really can go either way. So what does the projected record look like based on how tough this schedule is for Alabama? Again, we count the couple green games as wins, the couple of blue games as wins as well. Then you average out these 3 purple games at 60%. Then you average out these 50-50 games at 50%. Again, you got 5 50-50 games. Let's say they probably win 3 out of these 5 50-50 games, but let's say they probably slip up in one of these purple games. Let's say they probably lose 2 50-50 games and then probably slip up in one of these purple games. Let's say they probably slip up against Florida State or Auburn just because they're both on the road. That's going to give you 3 losses, and then you got 3 wins in those 50-50 games. That's going to give you a projection of 9-3. So that is what the projected record comes out to be for Alabama. Again, you got 5 50-50 games. Let's say they win like 3 out of the 5, and then they lose 3 more games. They lose 2 50-50 games, and then one of those purple games as well. That is how the projection came out to be 9-3. I think the worst case scenario is probably 8-4. I don't really think Alabama could go 8-4, but it would be a big shock if they did. And then 10-2. That's probably the best case scenario here for the Crimson Tide. But we'll see if Alabama can make the college football playoff. But just as of right now, based on this schedule, their overall projected record is 9-3. Do you guys agree or disagree? Let me know in the comments below. And also, give me your thoughts about Alabama's schedule. Is it tough or not so tough? Thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned for more sports content videos on my Lucas Ross Sports YouTube channel.